It all started with a phone call that no one could forget. The kind of call that leaves your stomach twisting, your heart racing, and your mind screaming that something, somewhere, had gone horribly wrong. Imagine sitting in your living room, sipping your morning coffee, when suddenly your phone rings and the voice on the other end is trembling, almost whispering, "If anything happens to me, you can't trust the silence that follows." It's the kind of line that haunts you. And for the fictional Hollywood director Robert Harlan and his wife, Elaine, that call became their final warning. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Robert Harlan wasn't just any director. For nearly 5 decades, he had crafted stories that defined generations. His films were beloved for their humor, their heart, and the raw humanity he brought to every frame. But behind the glamour, the awards, and the red carpet smiles, there was a family tension so deep it had been carefully hidden from the public eye. Robert's son, Nicholas, once the golden boy of the family, had been quietly cut out of the director's will. The reasons were private, tangled, and full of resentment. Yet nobody imagined how far Nicholas' anger would eventually go. But let's pause for a moment. Ask yourself, could a single act of greed and betrayal really shatter an entire family? Could a beloved Hollywood icon, a man whose movies had made millions laugh and cry, fall victim to the one person he trusted the most? And if so, what warning signs were ignored, what whispers dismissed, and what desperate moments went unnoticed before the tragedy struck? The story we're about to unravel is not just shocking, it's heartbreaking. It's a tale of love, ambition, secrecy, and a darkness that no one saw coming. It's a reminder that even those who live in the brightest spotlight can have shadows darker than the night itself. Over the next hour, you'll witness a series of events so intense, so emotionally charged, that you may find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about family, loyalty, and the price of betrayal. Let's step back a bit. Robert and Elaine Harlan had built a life together that many envied. Their home in Los Angeles was a palace of success, filled with accolades, rare art, and memories carefully preserved in photographs lining the walls. Friends and colleagues often described the couple as the epitome of a Hollywood power pair, brilliant, charming, yet undeniably private. Few had seen the cracks forming beneath the surface, and fewer still understood the simmering tension that would one day boil over into catastrophe. Nicholas Harlan, meanwhile, was a study in contrasts. To the public, he was a charismatic and talented young man, following in his father's footsteps, but always trying to carve out his own identity. Privately, however, he felt abandoned, ignored, and, most of all, betrayed. Being removed from his father's will had ignited a fury in him that nobody could fully grasp. Could one act of exclusion create a perfect storm of jealousy, rage, and desperation? The answer, as we'll see, is chillingly yes. And here's the thing about human nature. Sometimes, the very people we trust the most are the ones capable of unimaginable acts. Perhaps you've wondered about this yourself, maybe in your family, your circle of friends, or even in a workplace. How do ordinary people become capable of extraordinary betrayal? That question lingers like a shadow over every moment in this story. Every gesture, every whispered conversation, every minor disagreement now takes on a weight it never had before. Let's fast forward to that fateful day. The sun had barely risen over Los Angeles when a neighbor noticed something odd, a light that had stayed on through the night, a mailbox left overflowing, and an unusual stillness around the grand estate. When authorities arrived, what they discovered inside would send shockwaves through the city, through Hollywood, and through the minds of everyone who ever admired Robert Harlan. Before we dive into the details of that discovery, it's worth asking, how could such a tragedy have been prevented? Were there signs that the public never saw, clues that the family may have ignored, or warnings buried in conversations too subtle to notice until it was too late? And most importantly, how did a dispute over inheritance, something as mundane as a will, spiral into a horror story that nobody anticipated? As we explore this story, you'll meet people who loved Robert and Elaine, individuals who knew Nicholas in ways few outsiders could understand. You'll hear about the tensions, the arguments, and the moments of doubt that painted a picture of a family slowly unraveling. And you'll see, in sharp, undeniable detail, how ambition, resentment, and desperation collided in a perfect storm of tragedy. It's also worth noting that this story isn't just about a crime. It's about humanity, about the fragile lines between love and hate, loyalty and betrayal, hope and despair. It's a story that forces us to ask difficult questions. What would we do if faced with similar betrayal? How far could resentment drive us? And how often do we ignore the early warning signs in the people we think we know best? By now, you might be wondering what ultimately pushed Nicholas over the edge. Was it a single moment of rage, years of simmering anger, or a combination of both? And how did Robert, a man celebrated for his insight into human behavior, fail to see the danger in his own home? These questions are the spine of our story, and they will unravel piece by piece, each revelation more shocking than the last. And here's a twist to keep you on edge. The events leading up to the tragedy weren't entirely private. Certain behaviors, strange conversations, and unusual patterns had been noticed by close friends, colleagues, and even strangers. Yet, for reasons that remain part of the mystery, nobody acted in time. Could it be that fame and fortune created a false sense of security, masking the warning signs? Or was it something more sinister, something deeper in human nature that refuses to be controlled, no matter how powerful or wealthy you are? As we continue, remember this: nothing in this story is as it first appears. Every relationship has hidden layers, every smile hides a secret, and every family has a story behind the closed doors. What we'll reveal in the next chapters will challenge your assumptions about love, loyalty, and the deadly consequences of betrayal. But just when you think you understand the trajectory of this tale, be prepared for twists that defy logic and shatter expectation. From heated arguments in private rooms to clandestine phone calls that hint at a deeper darkness, the path this family took toward tragedy is as shocking as it is heartbreaking. And what comes next? The moments leading up to that final, fateful day will leave you breathless. So buckle up. Over the course of this story, you'll experience heartbreak, tension, suspense, and revelation. You'll see the glamorous world of Hollywood through a lens you've never seen before, stripped of its illusions, exposing the raw human drama beneath. And by the end, you may never look at fame, fortune, or even family in the same way again. The cameras never saw what was happening behind the Harlan estate gates. To the public, Robert Harlan and Elaine were the perfect Hollywood couple, charming, talented, and untouchable. But behind closed doors, the story was far darker, far more tangled, and far more human than anyone could imagine. It started subtly, in ways that were almost invisible to outsiders. Robert, once a warm, engaging father, had grown increasingly protective of his life and his legacy. Every conversation about his estate, every mention of the will, was met with tension that even close friends could sense. Elaine tried to mediate, but even her patience had limits. When Nicholas was removed from the will, the tension became palpable, a storm quietly brewing under the calm surface of family life. Imagine, for a moment, being Nicholas. A young man in a world where your father is larger than life, where every achievement feels just out of reach, and where your dreams are constantly measured against a legend. The sting of exclusion, the feeling of betrayal, would fester. And for Nicholas, it did. His resentment was like a shadow following him everywhere, growing heavier each day. Friends noticed subtle changes. A quick temper, moments of silence that stretched uncomfortably, and flashes of anger that seemed disproportionate to minor annoyances. But Nicholas had learned to hide it too, mastering the art of charm, masking his inner storm. Meanwhile, Robert and Elaine were navigating their own pressures. Hollywood is a world of constant scrutiny, of endless gossip, and of unrelenting competition. Even the smallest misstep can become a headline. In this environment, personal grievances can easily be hidden, or, sometimes, completely ignored. Robert, a man celebrated for his insight into human nature, perhaps believed that love and reason would prevail. Elaine, ever the diplomat, tried to maintain harmony, hoping that patience and understanding could bridge the widening chasm between father and son. But some rifts run too deep to be mended by goodwill alone. Let's take a moment to examine the psychological pressure that builds in a family like this. Power, wealth, and fame can be intoxicating, but they also create an invisible prison. Every decision is scrutinized, every action weighed for its potential impact on reputation. For Nicholas, being cut out of the will wasn't just a financial blow. It was a public declaration that he was somehow unworthy, an act that struck at the very core of his identity. For a young man in his 20s, raised in the shadow of a celebrity father, the humiliation was nearly unbearable. And yet, outwardly, the family maintained appearances. Dinner parties, charity events, and public appearances continued as normal. To the casual observer, nothing seemed amiss. But inside, the emotional temperature was rising. Small arguments escalated, words once brushed off began to sting, and trust, once a foundation, began to crumble. Every conversation about money, every discussion about inheritance, became a battlefield. And the deeper the conflict went, the less anyone outside could perceive the danger lurking beneath the surface. Ask yourself this. If someone in your own life was quietly seething with anger and resentment, would you recognize the signs before it was too late? Could you spot the subtle shifts in tone, the barely perceptible changes in behavior, the moments when charm masks a storm brewing underneath? This is the question that would haunt everyone in the Harlan household in the weeks before the tragedy. It's also important to understand the complexity of family loyalty. Robert loved his son, despite the growing distance and tension. Elaine, too, tried to maintain a connection, believing that bridges could still be built. But love, while powerful, is not always enough to prevent disaster. The combination of hurt, pride, and perceived betrayal can be combustible, especially when fueled by ambition and desperation. For Nicholas, every interaction with his parents was now filtered through the lens of exclusion, every casual remark a potential insult, every glance a judgment. One evening, a conversation that seemed routine became a turning point. The family gathered for dinner, a rare moment when all three were in the same room. The atmosphere was tense, words clipped and polite on the surface, but loaded with unspoken meaning. Nicholas asked about the family estate, the will, and inheritance, probing carefully, trying to gauge his father's intentions. Robert responded with measured calm, attempting to defuse tension, but the damage had been done. The air crackled with resentment, and for the first time, Elaine sensed the full magnitude of the threat she had been trying to ignore. As the weeks went on, Nicholas' behavior became more unpredictable. Friends noticed that he was isolating himself, spending long hours alone, obsessively reviewing conversations, and dwelling on perceived injustices. Was it paranoia or a calculated plan forming? Nobody could say for certain, but the signs were there, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably present. It was a quiet warning that tragedy was looming. Meanwhile, Robert and Elaine continued with their public lives, attending premieres, award ceremonies, and social events. The juxtaposition was striking, a family appearing perfect to the world, while simultaneously unraveling behind the scenes. The contrast between the Hollywood spotlight and the shadows in their home could not have been more stark. And this is where the story becomes a study in human complexity. How can someone so loved, so admired, be vulnerable to such a profound betrayal? How can appearances mask such a dangerous undercurrent? It's also worth noting the broader implications of this scenario. Families across the world have experienced the corrosive effects of inheritance disputes, jealousy, and resentment. But when these conflicts occur in the context of fame and wealth, the stakes are amplified. Secrets that might have been contained in an ordinary household become headlines, rumors spread, and the world watches, often with morbid fascination. This is why the Harlan story resonates so powerfully. It is both uniquely Hollywood and universally human. And yet, no one could have predicted the final sequence of events. The tension, though visible in hindsight, seemed manageable to everyone involved. The tragic crescendo that would follow was inconceivable, yet inevitable, given the trajectory of resentment, pride, and anger that had been building for months. Every missed warning, every ignored sign, every unresolved conflict now formed a chain leading inexorably toward disaster. By now, you might be asking, what finally pushed Nicholas to the breaking point? What combination of emotions, thoughts, and perceived slights could compel a son to betray the very people who had given him life? These questions are central to understanding the story, and they will unravel in ways both shocking and heartbreaking in the chapters to come. But before we reach that moment, it's essential to explore the final days leading up to the tragedy. The conversations, the small incidents, the seemingly innocuous decisions. All of these threads form the tapestry of events that would culminate in disaster. And as we'll see, even the most careful planning, even the deepest love, could not prevent what was about to unfold. The shadows behind the spotlight were growing longer, darker, and more dangerous. And in a matter of days, the Harlan family would face a moment that no amount of wealth, fame, or influence could avert. The morning of that fateful week began like any other in the Harlan estate. A sprawling mansion tucked into one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods, where luxury met secrecy, and every detail was meticulously curated. The sun rose over the city, casting golden light across manicured lawns, marble terraces, and the endless art collection that filled Robert and Elaine's home. On the surface, it was a picture of perfection. But beneath that calm, an invisible tension had begun to thrum, a subtle vibration that only those living inside the house could feel. Robert awoke early, as he always did, before the first rays of sunlight fully illuminated the city. He moved with purpose through the quiet corridors, his thoughts focused on mundane routines that masked a deeper unease. Today, he had a series of meetings with studio executives and a lunch scheduled with a longtime friend. Yet even as he dressed, he could not shake the gnawing sense that something was off. The kind of intuition that most people dismiss, but one he had learned to trust over decades in Hollywood. Elaine, ever the caretaker, had already begun her morning rituals. Coffee brewed, breakfast prepared, and a careful schedule laid out for the day. She moved with a grace honed over decades, but even she felt the tension in the air. Nicholas had been unusually quiet that morning, retreating to his room for hours, and there had been a terse exchange the night before over a minor disagreement about family finances. It was nothing alarming in isolation, but combined with weeks of simmering resentment, it was enough to create a palpable undercurrent of unease. Meanwhile, Nicholas lingered in his room, pacing and thinking. The exclusion from the will had lodged in his mind like a splinter, a constant irritation that festered with every interaction. He reviewed every conversation, every slight he imagined or remembered. In moments of calm, he plotted. In moments of agitation, he seethed. There was a dangerous intensity in his focus, a quiet but growing storm that would soon break. Friends who had visited him recently noted the change. His laughter had become sharper, his patience thinner, his charm edged with something almost imperceptibly menacing. This is the point where most stories of tragedy hinge, the deceptive calm before everything changes. To the world, the Harlan family appeared flawless. They were scheduled for public appearances, their calendars filled with events that reinforced their image of stability, glamour, and success. But behind closed doors, the emotional tension had reached a breaking point. Every smile, every polite conversation, every routine morning carried hidden weight. And in hindsight, these were the small, overlooked signals that foretold disaster. Ask yourself this: how often do we mistake surface calm for actual safety? How many tragedies are preceded by silent, subtle warnings that no one chooses to see or acknowledge? In the Harlan household, these questions were no longer theoretical. They were about to be tested in the most extreme way imaginable. As the morning unfolded, small incidents began to stack. A minor disagreement over scheduling, a curt response to a polite question, a door slammed a little too forcefully. All of these moments might seem trivial in isolation, but in the context of long-standing resentment, they became the sparks in a powder keg. And Nicholas, who had been brooding for weeks, was poised to ignite the explosion. In the hours that followed, Robert and Elaine moved through their day with a mix of routine and caution. Robert had meetings to attend, scripts to review, and correspondence to answer. Elaine managed the household staff, coordinated schedules, and attempted to maintain equilibrium. It was a delicate dance, one that required constant awareness and emotional intelligence. Yet, despite their efforts, the tension in the house remained, like an invisible thread stretching tighter with each passing moment. It's important to consider how ordinary details can become extraordinary in hindsight. The slight hesitation in Nicholas' voice, the careful avoidance of eye contact, the subtle signs of agitation. These were all breadcrumbs leading to a much larger story. In tragedies like this, hindsight is both revealing and haunting. We see the pieces clearly only after they have fallen into place, and the weight of inevitability becomes undeniable. By midday, the quiet tension had begun to manifest in more obvious ways. Nicholas had moved between rooms, speaking in half sentences, asking loaded questions, and reacting defensively to even the smallest remarks. Robert, experienced in reading human behavior, noticed the subtle cues but perhaps underestimated the intensity of his son's anger. Elaine tried to intercede, speaking softly, using humor and warmth to defuse the situation. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. The house settled, the storm appeared to pass. But the calm was deceptive. Let's pause and examine the psychological dynamics at play. Nicholas' behavior was a mix of calculated resentment and emotional volatility. He knew the stakes, understood the consequences, yet felt justified in his anger. Robert and Elaine, despite their insight into human nature, were trapped by their own assumptions. The belief that family loyalty, love, and patience could overcome the brewing darkness. It is a common pattern in tragic stories. The very qualities that make someone compassionate or trusting can also make them vulnerable to betrayal. And then came the first phone call. It was brief, almost casual, but carried an undercurrent of warning that would echo in hindsight. Robert answered with his usual calm, but there was a subtle tension in the air. Elaine sensed it too, a prickling at the edge of awareness that something was wrong, though neither could articulate it fully. This moment, seemingly ordinary, was a pivotal piece in the unfolding tragedy. It was a reminder that danger often arrives quietly, without fanfare, disguised as normalcy. The afternoon continued with a mix of routine and subtle tension. The family interacted, performed their public-facing roles within the house, and attempted to maintain composure. But Nicholas' focus remained inward, circling around the perceived betrayal, the removed inheritance, and the growing sense of injustice that had consumed him. Every gesture from his parents, every word of caution, every attempt at reconciliation was filtered through this lens, interpreted as criticism, dismissal, or provocation. Here's a question for you. If someone you loved seemed to be spiraling toward a dangerous emotional state, would you recognize it? Could you intervene before it was too late, or would the outward appearances blind you to the inner storm? In the Harlan household, this question was not abstract. It was the reality they faced every hour of that day. By evening, the tension had reached a crescendo. Minor disagreements that would once have been resolved with humor or compromise now escalated quickly. The atmosphere, already heavy with unspoken resentments, became nearly unbearable. Friends who called later would describe the day as eerily normal in tone, yet the signs of danger were unmistakable in retrospect. This is the paradox of tragedies that unfold in private. They appear ordinary while the seeds of catastrophe are already germinating. As night fell, the family gathered for dinner. It was a quiet, strained affair. Words were measured, glances avoided, and the room seemed smaller than usual, the walls closing in under the weight of tension. It is often in these intimate moments that the true depth of familial conflict is revealed. Every gesture, every pause, every sigh carries significance. And in this dinner, the underlying resentment, fear, and unresolved anger were palpable, like a storm about to break, threatening to drown everything in its path. And yet, no one fully realized what was coming. The calm, the routine, the illusions of safety, all of it was about to be shattered. Nicholas, pushed by weeks of simmering rage, approached a point of no return. Robert and Elaine, despite decades of insight into human behavior and countless professional experiences, could not have predicted the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The calm before the storm, as the saying goes, is deceptive. It is quiet, subtle, and almost comforting. But it is also the moment when tension peaks, when anticipation grows, and when tragedy prepares to strike. In the Harlan household, this calm was about to be replaced by chaos, heartbreak, and events that would leave everyone questioning how they could have missed the signs. And then, As the night deepened, the first irreversible actions were taken. Small, seemingly insignificant choices that would snowball into catastrophe. A door left unlocked, a phone call ignored, a conversation overheard. Tiny details that would later be examined under intense scrutiny. In hindsight, these moments were critical. They were the threads that, once pulled, unraveled the entire fabric of the family's life. The evening air inside the Harlan estate carried an unusual weight, thick with tension and unspoken words. Every household has moments where tempers flare, where small disagreements grow into arguments. But few are prepared for the kind of escalation that occurs when resentment has been simmering unchecked for weeks or even months. On that fateful night, the Harlan household was a pressure cooker, ready to explode. Nicholas had spent the day in a tense, self-contained world, moving between rooms and replaying conversations in his head. The removal from his father's will was not just a financial blow. It was an emotional one, a rejection he could not let go of. He had tried to mask his feelings, to act normal in front of his parents and friends, but the emotional dam was beginning to crack. Every glance from Robert, every word from Elaine, seemed to him like a reminder of what he had lost and what he believed he deserved. Meanwhile, Robert and Elaine were unaware of just how close the storm was. They believed they were dealing with the kind of family tension that could be smoothed over with communication and patience. In hindsight, it was clear that their approach, rooted in empathy and rationality, was insufficient for the intensity of Nicholas' internal turmoil. But they were experienced, thoughtful people. They did what they thought was right. And that, as we'll see, was part of the tragedy. The evening started innocuously, with dinner served in the grand dining room. Crystal glasses reflected the soft glow of chandelier lights, plates carefully arranged with precision, and the aroma of a carefully prepared meal filling the air. On the surface, it was a picture of domestic perfection. Yet the conversation was terse, measured, and fraught with tension. Small comments were met with sharp responses. Long silences hung like heavy clouds. Elaine tried to mediate, her voice calm and conciliatory, but even her efforts could not mask the growing chasm between father and son. This is where the psychological dynamics became critical. When someone has nurtured anger and resentment over time, ordinary interactions become triggers. Words that once would have been ignored now feel like personal attacks. Gestures that once would have been comforting now feel like insults. In Nicholas' mind, the world had narrowed into a singular focus, the perceived betrayal by his parents. Every action they took, no matter how well-intentioned, was now filtered through this lens. Ask yourself this. Have you ever experienced a situation where a minor incident felt like a personal attack? Where a passing remark carried the weight of judgment or rejection? Multiply that intensity by years of unresolved resentment, and you begin to understand the psychological tension building inside Nicholas. This is the kind of pressure that can distort perception, cloud judgment, and lead to actions that seem unfathomable to those on the outside. As dinner progressed, the conversation inevitably turned to family business. Robert attempted to discuss future projects, charitable endeavors, and ongoing commitments. Elaine interjected with reminders of appointments and social obligations. Nicholas listened, nodding occasionally, but his mind was elsewhere. He was analyzing, calculating, and anticipating every move, every word, every glance. The meal, though outwardly calm, was a battlefield of subtle emotional exchanges. Then came the moment that would later be cited by investigators as a turning point. A seemingly innocuous comment from Robert about family responsibilities triggered a reaction in Nicholas that was immediate and intense. Words were exchanged, short, clipped, and loaded with subtext. Elaine tried to intervene, her voice rising slightly in an attempt to restore calm, but the damage had been done. The emotional dam had cracked. From that moment, the evening became a rapid escalation of tension. Nicholas' behavior shifted visibly, pacing, clenched fists, and bursts of sharp speech. Robert, experienced in managing conflict, attempted to reason, to appeal to logic, to remind Nicholas of family bonds and shared history. But reasoning with someone in the grip of intense emotional turmoil is a delicate, often futile, exercise. Elaine's attempts at mediation only heightened the emotional stakes. She was balancing fear, anger, and love, trying desperately to maintain control while the situation spiraled out of her grasp. It's important to understand that these moments, while emotionally charged, were still ordinary in appearance to an outsider. A dinner argument, a family disagreement, a tense exchange, these are things many households experience. What made this situation extraordinary was the accumulation of prior grievances, the intensity of Nicholas' resentment, and the inability of Robert and Elaine to recognize the true magnitude of the danger. The tension reached a crescendo when Nicholas made a statement that, in retrospect, was chilling. It was not a threat in the traditional sense, but it carried an unmistakable undercurrent of anger and calculation. Observers, reading between the lines after the fact, would later describe it as a moment that foreshadowed the tragedy to come. In that statement, the simmering resentment, the sense of injustice, and the emotional storm that had been building for months became visible, even if subtle. At this point, the family dynamic had shifted irreversibly. Robert and Elaine were caught between their desire to maintain peace and the urgent need to address escalating danger. Nicholas, meanwhile, was fully immersed in his own narrative of betrayal, anger, and entitlement. The psychological distance between father and son had widened to the point where reconciliation seemed impossible, and the seeds of tragedy had taken root. Throughout the evening, small details would later be scrutinized by experts trying to understand what happened. The placement of chairs, the tone of voice, the sequence of words spoken, all became critical pieces of evidence in reconstructing the emotional environment that led to disaster. It is often in these minute details that the truth of a story emerges, revealing patterns of behavior that, at the time, seemed inconsequential but ultimately shaped the course of events. By the time the evening drew to a close, the house was tense and heavy with unresolved conflict. Robert retired to his study, Elaine to her bedroom, and Nicholas to his own space. Yet the emotional storm had not abated. It lingered, coiled like a snake ready to strike, its presence felt in every shadow, every silence, every half-spoken thought. The night was far from ordinary, and the calm that seemed to follow the dinner table was only a brief interlude before the next stage of unraveling. At this moment, the story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. How does someone move from simmering resentment to irreversible action? How do patterns of emotional neglect, perceived injustice, and unresolved conflict interact with personality, pride, and psychological pressure to create catastrophic outcomes? In Nicholas' case, these forces had aligned perfectly, creating a scenario in which tragedy became not just possible, but inevitable. And yet, even in these dark hours, there were moments of normalcy, moments where hope lingered. A shared joke, a brief smile, a gesture of care, all of it coexisted with the mounting tension, illustrating the complex, contradictory nature of human behavior. This is the paradox of family drama: love and hate, loyalty and betrayal, hope and despair, all intertwined, often in ways that are impossible to separate until after the fact. As the night deepened, the first irreversible actions were quietly set in motion. Nicholas, consumed by a combination of anger, planning, and distorted reasoning, began making choices that would have cascading consequences. Each step, each decision, however minor it seemed at the time, contributed to the trajectory of the unfolding tragedy. In hindsight, these actions appeared deliberate and calculated. But in the moment, they were cloaked in the ordinary, hidden behind routine behaviors and mundane activities. And so, the unraveling had begun. The carefully constructed veneer of family life, the routines, the appearances of stability, all were starting to fracture under the weight of unresolved emotional conflict. What seemed like a single evening of tension was in fact the tipping point, the moment where months of hidden resentment, anger, and disappointment converged into a storm that could no longer be contained. The morning after the tension-filled dinner began quietly, almost deceptively so. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Harlan estate, brushing over the polished floors and ornate furniture. It was the kind of serene start that made the previous night's storm feel like a bad dream. But appearances can be deceiving, and in the Harlan household, the calm was fragile, like ice forming over a deep, dark lake. One misstep, one spark, and the surface would crack to reveal the chaos beneath. Robert awoke early, as was his habit, determined to maintain control over the day despite the lingering tension. His mind, however, was restless. He replayed the previous evening in fragments. Nicholas' terse remarks, Elaine's subtle attempts to mediate, the pauses and silences that felt heavier than they should have. He wondered if he had missed something critical, some warning sign that could have prevented the rising storm. In Hollywood, intuition is everything, and Robert had trusted his instincts countless times before, but never in a situation quite like this. Elaine, meanwhile, moved through the morning with a practiced grace, tending to breakfast preparations and household routines. She sensed the tension radiating from Nicholas' room, a subtle vibration she could feel even from across the house. Something was wrong, but it was hard to put a finger on it. It's a paradox often faced by families. You can feel the threat without understanding its origin or scope. And in households like the Harlans, where appearances are paramount, acknowledging danger can feel almost impossible. Nicholas, on the other hand, was already in motion. His mind churned with a mixture of resentment, planning, and simmering anger. He revisited every slight, imagined or real, from the past months. The removal from his father's will was a wound that had festered in silence, and now it demanded acknowledgement, his way, on his terms. Every action he took, every calculated movement, was fueled by this unresolved rage. He moved through the house with purpose, every step measured, every glance a signal that the tension was far from over. It is often in these ordinary moments that extraordinary tragedies begin. A conversation about schedules, a disagreement over minor household duties, a casual remark. Any of these could ignite the carefully contained anger. In hindsight, these were the small fractures in the family's foundation, the subtle cracks that foreshadowed disaster. And yet, at the time, they appeared mundane, insignificant, ordinary. The breakfast table, a seemingly banal setting, became a stage for the first escalation of the day. Robert attempted light conversation, speaking about upcoming projects and pressing matters at work. Elaine tried to interject humor and warmth, to ease the lingering tension from the previous night. Nicholas, however, was emotionally distant, his responses clipped and his tone sharp. Every word felt loaded, every gesture suspicious. The previous night's unresolved arguments lingered, coloring each interaction with unspoken hostility. Ask yourself, how often do small disagreements become emotionally charged when past resentments are involved? How easily can pride, perceived betrayal, and anger magnify minor incidents into major crises? The Harlan household now existed in a state of heightened alert, where even ordinary conversations carried the potential for explosive outcomes. As the morning progressed, Nicholas' behavior became more erratic. He moved between rooms, opening and closing doors, checking on trivial matters, and engaging in fleeting interactions that seemed normal but were laden with tension. Robert and Elaine noticed, but could not fully comprehend the magnitude of what was brewing. It's a common pattern in domestic conflicts. The signs are there, but cognitive biases, trust, and emotional attachment often prevent adults from recognizing the danger until it's too late. Throughout the house, staff and visitors sensed the underlying tension as well. Subtle cues, a heavy sigh, a hurried gesture, a tense pause, conveyed more than words could. Yet, in households accustomed to wealth, privacy, and appearances, these signals are often dismissed. Outsiders might interpret them as stress, fatigue, or normal familial tension. But in truth, they were harbingers of an emotional storm that had been intensifying for months. By midday, the situation had become more precarious. Nicholas' internal narrative had fully taken hold. He viewed himself as wronged, excluded, and justified in his feelings of anger. Every interaction with his parents reinforced this perception, amplifying his sense of injustice. Robert and Elaine, despite their experience, were ill-equipped to navigate this level of emotional intensity. Their attempts at calm reasoning and mediation were perceived as dismissive or controlling by Nicholas, deepening the emotional divide. In families like this, where pride and reputation weigh heavily, reconciliation becomes increasingly difficult. Robert, a man celebrated for understanding human behavior in fictional narratives, found himself powerless in reality. Elaine, a mediator and caretaker, faced the same frustration. Their love and patience, while profound, were insufficient to bridge the psychological chasm that had formed. By mid-afternoon, the tension in the house had reached a palpable intensity. Minor incidents, a dropped utensil, a slightly raised voice, a glance misinterpreted, contributed to the emotional buildup. In hindsight, these were the dominoes in a chain reaction that would soon culminate in tragedy. Each small moment seemed trivial at the time, but collectively, they formed a pattern of escalating conflict. Now, consider this. The most dangerous moments in family conflicts are often invisible to outsiders. They occur in private spaces, behind closed doors, and in seemingly mundane interactions. The Harlan household, like many high-profile families, was a study in appearances. To the public, everything seemed perfect. Behind the scenes, however, the cracks were deepening, invisible yet undeniable. As evening approached, the culmination of hours of tension became evident. Nicholas, driven by emotion and perception, began to take decisive actions that would change the trajectory of the day and eventually the family's lives. Robert and Elaine remained engaged in routine activities, unaware that the storm was about to break. The ordinary routines that filled the house, cooking, cleaning, phone calls, were now intertwined with an invisible but potent undercurrent of danger. And then, a minor argument erupted, seemingly over nothing. The trigger was insignificant, yet the emotional context made it a flashpoint. Voices were raised, gestures became sharper, and the calm of the house dissolved. It is often in these ordinary moments, seemingly inconsequential, that critical turning points occur. What might have been a trivial disagreement in another family became a catalyst for escalation in the Harlan's home. It's important to pause and reflect. In situations of long-standing resentment, ordinary interactions are often reframed by perception. Every gesture, word, and tone is filtered through an emotional lens, magnifying small incidents into major conflicts. In Nicholas' case, his perception of betrayal and exclusion created a psychological environment in which ordinary arguments were experienced as personal attacks. As night approached, the Harlan family found themselves navigating a fragile, volatile environment. Small choices. The direction of a conversation, a door left open, a glance exchanged, carried consequences far beyond their apparent significance. The house, for all its elegance and sophistication, had become a crucible of tension, a place where long-simmering resentments were ready to ignite into irreversible action. And in this environment, the stage was set for the tragedy that would follow. The calm of the afternoon had been deceptive. The seemingly ordinary day, full of routine and habit, had transformed into a crucible of human emotion. And by the time darkness fell, the Harlan household would be poised on the precipice of disaster. But what happened in the hours that followed would leave an indelible mark, not just on the family, but on everyone who thought they knew the story. The unraveling was about to accelerate, and nothing would ever be the same. The night had settled over the Harlan estate, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and the pristine interiors of the mansion. From the outside, it could have been any ordinary evening in a family home, with the glow of lights behind drawn curtains and the faint hum of life within. But inside, the atmosphere was electric with a tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. What had started as simmering resentment over months. The subtle slights, the perceived injustices, the exclusion from the inheritance, was now approaching a critical point. Nicholas moved quietly through the house, each step deliberate, each thought circling in a complex web of anger, betrayal, and justification. In his mind, the past weeks, months, and even years were a ledger of grievances, with every omission, every perceived slight, and every parental decision carefully accounted for. To an observer, he may have appeared calm, even controlled. But internally, he was a storm contained only by a fragile barrier of reason and planning. And that barrier was cracking. Robert Harlan, meanwhile, was occupied in his study. Decades of experience in storytelling and human psychology had trained him to read subtle cues, to anticipate behavior, and to navigate conflict with precision. Yet no training, no insight, and no intuition could fully prepare him for the reality that had been building in his own home. He sensed tension, yes, but the scale and immediacy of what was coming remained obscured. It's a tragic paradox. Even the most perceptive people can miss the warning signs when emotions run this deep. Elaine, moving between the kitchen and living room, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She tidied up, poured drinks, and offered smiles that were intended to soothe, not provoke. But smiles can only do so much when the air is charged with unresolved anger. She had spent years balancing the family, mediating disputes, and softening conflicts. But even her considerable skill could not dissipate the intensity of Nicholas' emotions. It's important to pause here and reflect on the psychology of escalation. When resentment accumulates over time, the mind begins to reframe ordinary interactions as hostile, rejection as personal attack, and boundaries as obstacles to be overcome. Nicholas' internal world was now governed by this lens. Every word from his parents, every gesture, every sigh, even the way they looked at him, was interpreted through a filter of perceived betrayal. And in that filter, logic and empathy are often overridden by emotion, creating conditions ripe for irreversible decisions. The first cracks of confrontation began subtly. A misplaced comment about household responsibilities sparked an exchange that, on its own, might have been trivial. But for Nicholas, it was fuel for the fire. Words were clipped, voices slightly raised, and glances exchanged that conveyed more than the words themselves. Elaine tried to interject with humor and warmth, but her interventions only heightened the tension, reminding Nicholas, in his mind, of the parental authority that had excluded him. Ask yourself, have you ever been in a situation where minor words or gestures felt like monumental slights? Where frustration, disappointment, or anger magnified the ordinary into something seemingly unbearable? Multiply that by years of unresolved family conflict, and you begin to understand the psychological pressure in the Harlan household. By late evening, the situation had escalated beyond verbal sparring. Nicholas' movements were sharper, his tone more biting, and the calm of the house shattered. Robert and Elaine tried to maintain composure, appealing to reason and memory of better days. They reminded Nicholas of past achievements, of family bonds, of the love that had always been present. But reason has little power when resentment is fully internalized. Nicholas no longer saw his parents' words as gestures of love. They were judgments, reminders of exclusion, and provocations that demanded response. During this critical period, the emotional stakes could not have been higher. Research in behavioral psychology suggests that when perceived injustice meets emotional arousal and planning capability, individuals are at their most volatile. Nicholas' intellect, combined with raw emotion, created a potent and dangerous mix. Every choice now carried the weight of potential catastrophe. Every inaction, every attempt at deflection or mediation, risked accelerating the tension toward a breaking point. Small events that evening became magnified. A dropped item, a misplaced cup, a casual sigh. Each became a trigger in the escalating narrative Nicholas had constructed in his mind. He moved with intention, yet masked his internal storm beneath routine gestures. Robert and Elaine, seasoned in managing interpersonal tensions, recognized subtle signs of escalation, but could not fully grasp the magnitude or immediacy of the risk. Meanwhile, the staff of the house sensed the underlying tension. Whispers exchanged in the kitchen, nervous glances, and careful observation of Nicholas' movements created an atmosphere of anxiety and anticipation. Outsiders may have perceived only normal household routines, yet those within the walls were acutely aware that something was not right. This dichotomy between appearance and reality is a hallmark of domestic tension in high-stakes families. The public sees normalcy, while private realities grow increasingly volatile. By nightfall, the family's interactions had transformed. The calm of earlier hours was gone, replaced by a charged, tense atmosphere where every gesture had meaning and every word could provoke. Dinner, previously uneventful, had given way to a series of small confrontations, each feeding into the emotional crescendo. Nicholas' perception of grievance, exclusion, and injustice now dominated every interaction, making reconciliation increasingly unlikely. And then came the moment that would define the night. A minor disagreement, a question about household arrangements, suddenly escalated. Nicholas reacted sharply, his words harsh, his tone accusatory. Robert attempted to calm the situation, appealing to logic and family loyalty, but Nicholas' focus was locked on perceived betrayal. Elaine's attempts at mediation were ineffective, and the emotional distance between son and parents had widened to a chasm that now seemed insurmountable. It's crucial to understand how quickly escalation can occur in situations like this. When unresolved resentment and emotional intensity converge, ordinary interactions can spiral into crises in moments. In Nicholas' case, his internal narrative of betrayal and entitlement had reached a point where action, no matter how extreme, felt justified. For Robert and Elaine, decades of insight and experience could not prevent the inevitable trajectory that had been set months, even years, earlier. By the late evening, the household had reached a critical tipping point. Subtle cues, gestures, and statements all contributed to a boiling point, a moment when the tension could no longer be contained. The calm that had masked the storm earlier in the day had vanished, replaced by a sense of foreboding that everyone in the house could feel, even if they could not articulate it. And yet, despite the intensity of the evening, there were moments of normalcy. Small, fleeting instances of laughter, casual movement, or routine interaction. These moments created a deceptive rhythm, lulling observers into a false sense of safety. In hindsight, they were illusions, masking the true trajectory of the family's emotional storm. As the night deepened, the first irreversible actions were quietly set into motion. Choices made in anger, frustration, and perceived justification began to create consequences that could no longer be undone. The Harlan family, for all its wealth, influence, and insight into human behavior, was now operating in a reality where ordinary control mechanisms, reason, mediation, love, were no longer sufficient to prevent tragedy. And so, the tension reached its absolute peak. The ordinary day, filled with routine, small gestures, and subtle confrontations, had transformed into a crucible of human emotion. Every interaction, every word, every gesture now carried the weight of potential catastrophe. The Harlan family, poised on the brink, was about to cross a threshold from which nothing would be the same. The night air settled over the Harlan estate like a velvet curtain, masking the storm brewing within. From the outside, all was quiet, lights dimmed, windows closed, and the sprawling mansion standing in serene stillness. Yet inside, the atmosphere was electric, every corner charged with tension that had been building for months. This was no ordinary evening. This was the night that would define the Harlan family forever. Nicholas had spent the day rehearsing scenarios in his mind, moving through possibilities with a meticulous intensity. Each conversation, each potential confrontation, had been analyzed and replayed repeatedly. He felt justified, empowered even, in his belief that his grievances demanded acknowledgement, resolution, and, ultimately, action. To him, the night was a culmination of months of perceived betrayal. A point at which he could no longer remain silent, passive, or patient. Robert, as always, moved with the calm efficiency that had defined his career and personal life. He was unaware of the full intensity of the storm brewing in his son's mind. He had sensed tension but had no framework for predicting the scale or immediacy of the danger. Decades of understanding human behavior, countless hours of directing actors in scenarios of conflict, and a lifetime of social intuition could not shield him from the personal tragedy that was about to unfold. Elaine, ever the mediator, floated between rooms, attempting to maintain normalcy. She tried humor, soft conversation, and gentle interjections, each effort intended to dissipate the growing tension. But her attempts, while well-meaning, were ineffective against the focused intensity of Nicholas' internal storm. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, was filtered through the lens of resentment and perceived injustice that dominated his mind. This is the moment where ordinary interactions become extraordinary. The slightest gesture, the most benign comment, can ignite a chain reaction that escalates beyond anyone's control. In the Harlan home, these interactions were amplified by the months of simmering resentment that Nicholas had nurtured, creating conditions for a catastrophe that seemed almost inevitable in hindsight. As evening deepened, the family gathered for what would be the final dinner together. The table was set with precision, reflecting years of tradition and routine. Crystal glasses sparkled, silverware gleamed, and the aroma of the meal filled the room. But beneath the veneer of civility, the air was charged with anticipation, unspoken accusations, and fragile patience. Every glance, every word, every pause carried weight. Nicholas' behavior during the meal was increasingly unpredictable. His responses were clipped, his body tense, and his mind clearly elsewhere, replaying slights and imagined offenses. Robert attempted to steer the conversation toward neutral topics, hoping to distract his son from his internal agitation. Elaine, sensing the fragility of the moment, interjected with light humor and reminders of positive, shared memories. But the attempt at normalcy only created friction. To Nicholas, these gestures felt like condescension, attempts to dismiss his grievances, or even reminders of exclusion. Ask yourself, how often do we misinterpret gestures of care when we are consumed by anger or resentment? How often does perception, filtered through a lens of emotional pain, distort reality and magnify the ordinary into something intolerable? For Nicholas, this distortion had reached a dangerous intensity, creating a psychological environment in which catastrophic decisions could feel rational. The tension escalated incrementally. A misplaced utensil, a delayed response, a slight shift in posture, all became triggers in the emotionally charged atmosphere. The calm that had masked danger earlier in the day was gone. It had been replaced by a dynamic of heightened sensitivity, where every interaction carried the potential for conflict. During the meal, a conversation about the family estate arose, a topic that had been at the heart of Nicholas' resentment for months. The discussion was measured, factual, and devoid of malice from Robert and Elaine. Yet in Nicholas' mind, it became a symbol of betrayal and exclusion. Every word from his father was interpreted as judgment. Every suggestion from his mother felt like control. The simple act of discussing family responsibilities had transformed into a high-stakes psychological battlefield. It is here that the dynamics of escalation become crucial to understand. Emotional intensity, combined with cognitive biases and prior resentment, can create a feedback loop that amplifies perceived slights and diminishes rational response. In this feedback loop, ordinary interactions are no longer ordinary. They are triggers, catalysts, and justifications for action that may otherwise seem unthinkable. By the end of the meal, the tension had reached an apex. Nicholas' internal narrative had fully taken control, framing every interaction as hostile, every gesture as provocative, and every attempt at reconciliation as inadequate. Robert and Elaine, despite decades of insight into human behavior, were navigating a delicate landscape, attempting to manage escalating tension without fully comprehending its intensity. After dinner, the family retreated to separate spaces in an attempt to diffuse the tension. Robert returned to his study, Elaine moved to her bedroom, and Nicholas paced the halls, each step echoing with intent. The calm of separation was illusory. In truth, it was a prelude to escalation. Every decision, every step, every pause now contributed to the trajectory of events that were about to spiral beyond control. Consider the psychological phenomenon at play. When long-standing resentment is combined with perceived injustice, access to emotional triggers, and planning capability, the risk of irreversible action increases dramatically. Nicholas' mind had constructed a narrative in which action, however extreme, was justified. This narrative had been nurtured over months, shaped by perceived exclusion and reinforced by emotional isolation. The conditions were perfect for a crisis that would alter the course of the family's life forever. By late night, the first irreversible steps were quietly initiated. Small, seemingly inconsequential actions, checking doors, observing movements, preparing spaces, set the stage for events that would culminate in tragedy. In hindsight, these details appeared deliberate and chilling. In the moment, they were masked as ordinary behaviors, unnoticed by the parents and bystanders, but pivotal in shaping what was about to unfold. The household, while outwardly calm, had become a crucible of human emotion. Love, anger, resentment, and pride coexisted, tangled together in ways that made the evening unpredictable and dangerous. Every gesture, every word, and every choice now had profound consequences. The ordinary rhythms of domestic life had been replaced by an intense psychological tension that could no longer be contained. As midnight approached, the Harlan estate sat on the edge of disaster. The culmination of months of simmering resentment, weeks of tension, and a single triggering event, the removal from the will, had brought the family to a critical tipping point. The night that had begun with quiet routine had transformed into a landscape where ordinary behavior was amplified into danger, where perception dominated reality, and where tragedy was poised to strike. And then, the first irreversible action occurred. A moment so small at first glance, yet so significant in its impact, would set into motion the events that no one could have foreseen. The calm that had masked the storm was gone, replaced by an inevitability that had been building quietly, invisibly, for far too long. The night inside the Harlan estate had descended into a quiet tension that belied the storm brewing in Nicholas' mind. From the outside, the mansion remained a picture of serenity, polished marble floors gleaming in the soft glow of chandelier light, windows reflecting the calm night sky, and the hum of the city beyond its gates. But inside, the air was thick with anticipation, every corner of the house vibrating with emotional electricity. What had been simmering for months, the sense of betrayal, resentment, and exclusion, was about to erupt. Nicholas had spent the evening pacing, reviewing the interactions of the day, and replaying old grievances in his mind. Every look from his father, every gesture from his mother, had been catalogued and interpreted through the lens of perceived injustice. His thoughts circled endlessly. How he had been wronged, how he had been dismissed, how the removal from the will was proof of his parents' betrayal. In his mind, it was no longer a question of reconciliation. It was a matter of righting a perceived wrong by any means necessary. Robert Harlan, for all his experience in understanding human behavior, remained unaware of the intensity of his son's inner turmoil. He had sensed tension during dinner and throughout the day, but assumed it could be diffused through reason, patience, and empathy. Elaine, similarly, attempted to soothe the situation with gentle words, humor, and acts of care. Yet for Nicholas, these gestures were interpreted not as love, but as further evidence of exclusion and control. The calm of the house was deceptive. The storm had already formed, and it was only a matter of time before it struck.